So thank you then for coming back after that first focus on job planning, and I'm afraid you've got me again for the next session, talking about something else that is as equally as important. Thanks for my coffee. And I'm just going to check the timings of this next session, because we're obviously, even though this is our fourth time doing it, we've done a really bad job of staying on track. So lunch is at 12:15, isn't it, Steph?
Yeah.
And it's 11:30. And I know that we will need time for questions on this next one, so we'll. Okay, so measuring activity. So using clinical hours to contacts to keep track of service delivery and identify meaningful CIPs. That's what I've called this part of the session. And again, reminding you of where that sits in our overall strategy. At the top, we're aiming that trusts will be able to measure and benchmark their productivity. We've already spoken about the relevance of job planning as in part of that formula, as defining the planned input. And now I'm right at the other end of the spectrum, where I'm thinking about how do we look every day at what we did? How do we keep a track? What's that ready reckoner? What does it look like? How can we do that simply without being overly burdensome? And and why do we need one? Well, the first reason why we need a deployment tracker is because Lord Carter said we've got to have one. So that's reason enough, I guess. But equally, like I said on the title slide, I believe that if we have an appropriate and useful deployment tracker, it will help us evidence our productivity, but equally help us find that variation and that opportunity to improve. So this was my statement about deployment metrics. So deployment metrics can raise important messages at board level. I really do believe that. I mean, if we think about the the whole thing around safe staffing, nursing staffing levels, ratios for wards, all of that kind of thing, it's because they have an agreed standard of what good looks like, and therefore if they're not meeting it, it raises alarm bells. And we as we said in the job planning session, we really don't have that defined yet in terms of what we actually need in relation to the outputs and outcomes that we want to deliver. So I didn't see anyone take their phone out at that stage, so just saying, for those on Twitter. Okay, so at the end of the day, the board is there, isn't it? To the board's overall duty is to ensure the provision of safe services, and so why would huge parts of the workforce not be included in those workforce conversations? At the moment, it's very difficult to include us in those, because if we can't measure ourselves, how can we expect them to measure on our behalf? So it is really important that we, and I know that I'm preaching to the converted, but we know it's important that we've got to travel down this road and get to the place where we've got the evidence to the objective evidence to inform those discussions. And let's just be honest, we're not aiming. Did I just skip a slide? Let's just be honest about the elephant in the room. There's no secret pot of money somewhere that's going to give us loads more of who we are. We need to be in a place where we can define the right thing to do for the resource that we have, and then there's a conversation about, well, actually, if we can't do the right thing within the resource, that's a valid conversation. But what are the things that we can do more of? What are the things that we do less of? What are the things that we can do differently? All of those problem-solving conversations that need to happen for us to best optimise the use of the workforce, and not just the AHP workforce, the workforce in general. There's a lot of people nationally concerned with those kind of questions. We need the currency and the objective information so that we can be part of those discussions. So we did a piece of work, and again, apologies, this piece of work was a national data request, but it was just to the acute trusts. It was a long time ago now, and we asked them to let us know what their clinical hours were, and then how many contacts they saw. And this was the distribution that we got back. Again, take out the outliers. There's still quite significant distribution. Sorry. I mean, I don't know that I need to. Oh, so let me start at the beginning. So a deployment metric then is it's a measure of our input in relation to the activity that we deliver. It's a proxy measure. It's not an answer to everything. It's a vehicle to help you see whether roughly you're getting what you need from what you've got available today, and it will point, if used correctly, it will point you to the place where you will easily see that you have or that you haven't, or at least there's a question to be asked. So it's a vehicle for asking further questions rather than an answer by itself. It's important that we recognise that fact. Oh dear, I'm getting in a pickle with the slides. And I use this slide a lot actually, but these numbers were the numbers taken from the last NHS acute therapies benchmarking programme that told us for how many whole-time equivalents were imposed per 1,000 bed days. And it really does tell a story. It reminds us, doesn't it, that for those of us that are, or for those of you that are centrally deployed in a therapy service but delivering across, which is usually the case in acutes, probably slightly different in community teams, but you're a relatively small resource with quite a vast remit of where you could or couldn't deliver your interventions. And so we absolutely need to be showing that we're complying really with the NHS constitution, that we will deliver best value for taxpayers' money, and making sure that for the resource that we have available, we're reaching the patients that need us most. And again, I think the clinical hours to tracker is a vehicle that will help us to get there. So you'll recognise this as the template that you've got on your tables for the job planning, and we've already spoken about job planning, and the job planning direct clinical care time is these two columns here, and then obviously you've got your other columns. But for the purposes of the clinical hours to contacts, which is your deployment tracker, so it's something else, we actually need all the hours from the available clinicians that were available today included as clinical hours. And then we're putting that against the number of patients that were seen. So really crude, and at this point most people jump up and down and say, but I don't always see patients, I spend a lot of my time doing things that aren't patient facing. And we know that, and that's perfectly valid. And you mustn't worry, we want you to do that if that's the right thing to do for your patients. But in the end, like I said, this is a very crude tracker of clinical resource against the number of patients that were seen. And what we need to get to is that we understand how much clinical resource roughly we need for every patient contact, including the associated stuff that sits around that patient contact. That's the benchmark that we're trying to get to. If we only measured direct facing time against patients that you saw, that would take you on a race to losing all of this other time that you need. So we absolutely need to know the size of the service that is required to deliver that many contacts. Does that make sense to people? It's a really important point. I feel like I'm rushing through this a bit. So the characteristics of clinical hours contacts. I said it's a ratio of total clinical hours worked to direct interventions with patients. We know that you do lots and lots of things that aren't direct. And remember at the beginning I said we need to get to a place where we're collecting stuff that is simple, that is not burdensome, that doesn't take you down into the weeds. It's enough for us to know that you do that. We don't need to count it and report it nationally. albeit that locally you might well have more granular information that helps you understand your benchmark. So let's say, for example, Trust A had clinical hours to contacts on Monday of 4.5. That meant for every patient that was seen, there were 4.5 hours available from a clinician in the service. It doesn't mean that the patient contact lasted 4.5 hours, do you see? So on Tuesday, that same trust, the clinical hours to contacts was 2.8. So today, for every patient that was seen, there was only 2.8 hours available, and so on. Trust B, on Monday, clinical hours to contacts was 0.6. On Tuesday, clinical hours to contacts was 0.7. So you can see already there's there's something tangible that you to think about. So you might think, and again these are just hypotheses because we don't know where good is, and I will say that a lot throughout the day. We do need to get to a place where we do know what good is. So we need to get to a place where we can say, for each specialty or for each clinical pathway or for each service, however you define yourselves in a way that you can find your peers and compare, we need to get to a place where we have a benchmark range of clinical hours to contact. So clinical hours to contacts for, let's just say, elective orthopaedics, we might say should be somewhere between 0.8 and 1.4. I've just made those numbers up, by the way, but you get my point. Similarly, we might say for a community service, clinical hours, intermediate care, community service, you might say clinical hours to contact might be, I don't know, 4.5 to 6.2. That would be funny, wouldn't it? I'm sure it wouldn't be that, but you get my drift. It's about defining the right benchmark for the right service. So it's intended as a really high-level indicator of the available clinical resource for a specific period of time. The frequency with which it's collected obviously will make it meaningful or less meaningful. And initially we're working with trusts and we're just asking them to do it for month by month. In the end, we need to be able to do this daily in order to use it as effectively as we can, because in the end, if we get it right, it starts to help us inform where there's flex in the system. You might plan for the planned, but you might need a level of flexibility where you can easily redeploy hours to accommodate the things that you need to accommodate as a whole. So that's why we think in time it should be collected daily. And of course, in order to do that, you need an e-roster system that can easily give you that information, and one thing and another. So we actually learnt from what people are doing abroad. This isn't all made up by us here in England, but we've adapted it and tested it. And when we did our first test, we went out to every trust and asked them for this information. We asked them for their head counts, their full-time equivalents, the clinical hours they had available, the number of contacts. Added to that, we added on the staff costs from ESR. It's another conversation, but that's what we have at the moment that's to correlate. And from that, we were able to come out with different metrics. So we looked at clinical hours to contacts, which was obviously the one that we wanted to test. We looked at clinical hours per FTE. We looked at contacts per FTE. We looked at clinical hours as a percentage of total hours. So that's where trusts had research posts and things like that. And we looked at cost per contact. We were able to do all of that just from the information that people sent to us. You've seen that graph before. So thinking about, I said at the beginning, didn't I, that if we use clinical hours to contacts, it takes us to a place where we might find more meaningful CIPs. So at the moment, most of you, and in my recent memory from when I was in a provider land, really each year this budget came round and it was a little bit was sliced off, and that was your CIP. So it was, yes, there was an expectation that you would make a cost saving, but perhaps not necessarily a clear plan about how you might do that. And in the end, it comes down, doesn't it, to not filling vacant posts or something like that. And that, that's really short-sighted. It gets to a point where you're as lean as you possibly can be, and we need to think more we need to use more evidence to find more meaningful CIPs. I genuinely believe that. So one hypothesis might be that you increase the amount of clinical capacity that the AHP workforce can generate. So from your clinical hours to contacts, from doing that piece of work, you might find areas where, for example, in that trust that was 4.5 compared to 0.8, somewhere in there you might find some opportunity that there should be more clinical hours, and so over time you might suggest that that might be, because you can cost all these things. And actually I was delighted when we did our first AHP event in Derby. It was Derby, wasn't it?
Yep.
And Leicester Hospital have had their AHP services for 5 years in a row, or 4 years in a row. Their CIPs have been enabling CIPs. So actually the other divisions have given them money so that they could invest in AHPs to make a difference to their services overall for the trust. It made a difference to their length of stay for orthopaedics to various other things. And I'm not suggesting that that's a reality for all of us, and there will be, you know, from having this objective data, there actually will be some fair challenge back, saying, well, why are you doing that? Why, you know, this isn't all about saying we need more, it's about us being responsible, about saying what we can do differently. So, but I do give that as an example because in some genuine cases, we might see that that could be an outcome from this, that if you can deliver more activity, you can make a difference to those other service lines. So this, if you collect your clinical hours to contacts every day, we'll come on to the tools that you need to be able to do that. If you collect your clinical hours to contacts, you start to see a bit of a tracker like this, and you can see that this might be something that you might want to, I don't know how you feel about graphs, I quite like them. I'm a visual person, so you know, I'd rather see that than a table of numbers. And it highlights some things, doesn't it? It highlights the peaks and the troughs, and you might think, well, actually, if I'm running a service, I would much rather see something a bit more consistent. Or maybe not. You might know that on some days your demand is higher or your capacity is lower, and you're perfectly okay with that. So you might want to say why the peaks and troughs, why is it so different? Is that change being led by capacity? Am I not planning my clinical workforce as well as I could do? Have I got the legacy of some really old term time contracts or you know, and again, I don't mean to, I'm being a bit flippant, aren't I, because it's Friday. I don't mean to be disrespectful to flexible working. We should absolutely encourage that where we can accommodate it to meet service needs. But we know that sometimes there's a tip between what we're accommodating in terms of capacity and what the service might actually need to make it more efficient. So this gives you objective data to start to have some of those conversations. Equally, it might be that the demand changes, and again, through one of the trusts that we worked with in Wave 1, they found exactly that. So all the consultants were doing their surgery on specific days because they were going off to do something else somewhere else, and actually it needed to be loaded in certain ways, but they hadn't. It just goes to show, doesn't it, how one part of the workforce plans one thing and another part of the workforce plans another thing. What we need to get to is where we're all planning the same thing so that we can support each other in a more productive and efficient way. So to me, that was, again, just another advantage of collecting data like this. So quite basic data can throw up to you some quite significant findings that you may not have been aware of. So the other thing is, if you've got these peaks where every so often, you know, you've got really high numbers. So in that example that I said where a Trust A had 4.5 clinical hours for every patient that they were seeing, let's assume that that was a service where they didn't need that amount of time. You know, it wasn't complex or stroke rehab or something like that. It was, so you were surprised that they had that much time, or you were surprised. You may be surprised at what are they doing with the rest of that time, And again, this was in one of the Wave 1 sites. They did a bit of a time and motion to try and find out, well, where's all the time going? And it uncovered some quite interesting things. One of the things, this was how ad hoc all their admin bits were. So, for example, people would just approach them and say, oh, can you do this? It was a bit random, and it meant that they weren't being as efficient as they could be. So they've reorganised how they do stuff like annual leave requests. I know that's quite a small thing, but if you've got like 250 staff in your service, it makes quite a difference if you're not being as lean and organised as you can. And by doing that, they've reduced the amount of time that they're losing. So their clinical hours to contact has become, the number has reduced. And because of that, they're seeing more patients, and so because of that, their unmet need has reduced as well. So I think that's a real win-win, all from just starting to collect this clinical hours to contacts data.
You just explain what the axes are, the key to the axes.
So yeah, sorry. So this is like, yeah, that's good. I haven't got that on there. That's not very helpful, is it? So this is obviously the time, and this is the number of hours, and this is like the upper limit and the lower limit, like statistical things. So this graph, you just put your numbers in, the amount of clinical hours I had available today, and then you put in the number of contacts that you saw, and it generates you this graph. Does that answer it?
So they're both time.
So this is this is clinical hours.
So 2 clinical hours.
2.5 clinical hours, 2 clinical hours, and this is just the data points where we put them in. I mean, this is just an example that I've created. So each one of these, I just put some random numbers in to show you the sorts of graphs that you would get. But obviously this tracker tool exists and is available for you to use. So you could try that for your own services and see what shape of peaks and troughs that you might get. I'm not a statistician. This has been created from the quality improvement. You probably guessed that, yeah.
I see a lot of QI graphs, yeah, and they're often challenging.
Yes, yeah. Oh, I thought that was quite.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
Is it just me?
No. It's not just
What's? Go on. Let's try and solve this. What's the issue?
You need to label your axes.
Yes, I do. So I promise I'll do that next time.
Sorry, Ros.
I've obviously cut and pasted.
I'll sit at the back next time.
No, please don't. It's a really good challenge, and I've obviously cut and pasted and list off the axes. But this axis here is the number of clinical hours in the clinical hours to contact, and this axis here is the data point, so the days or weeks or
like day 5.
Yeah, that's that.
Brilliant.
So and then it kind of gives you a
for one
run
service.
chart.
It's not.
This is made up.
Yeah.
So I haven't.
It would be like one service. It's not like I've got it. Okay.
Yeah. Gosh, note to
Sorry.
self. Yeah. That's fine. So thinking about if we were thinking about how we could think about more meaningful improvement programs. So one meaningful improvement might be that you redeploy hours, because you might find if you're doing it for 2 or 3 services, you might find actually why have they got 4.5 for every patient that they're seeing, and why have they got 2.5? Let's again assume that we're comparing like with like, so that you would expect there to be more of a similarity within a range, and you might find that you can, again, it provides you with that objective information to start to redeploy hours. All people are looking a bit sceptic about that as well.
Does everybody understand the graph then? Do you need to just explain it a bit more? It's all right to put your hand up if we don't. Is everybody getting what that's showing?
Mm-hmm.
I think the challenge is that with services where you do have different teams delivering in a different way,
Yes.
the tendency will be, I feel, is that it will be lumped together to come out with more of an average, even within an acute hospital.
Right.
And so it's a case of what is it telling me really?
Yeah.
And I think this is definitely delivering data in a different way. I mean, again, I've looked at a lot of QI run charts, and I'm looking at saying that's actually telling me not a lot.
Yeah.
but and I think it's the challenge is that probably as AHPs we're problem solvers, but I think actually understanding what that is going to tell us and how we're going to use it.
Yes.
But my concern fundamentally is that because we have different ways of delivering,
Yeah.
it will get clumped together and
Yeah.
turned into data that we can't use.
Yeah.
Is that
Which is
really
what it
hard?
is at the moment. So on the model hospital, for example, we'll talk about that later. So the model hospital, unfortunate name, it is model community and model mental health as well. It's got all of the trusts on it. But the data is lumped together at trust aggregate level, which is less useful in identifying unwarranted variation. 100% I take your point. So locally with these tools, you can use them to collect it in the configuration that you would find useful to collect it. It needs to be like that so that you can, like you say, so that you don't lose the opportunity to find where the improvement might lie. That's in your gift to do, isn't it? You could do that for your service.
Just add something there. It's something to really take away and think, actually, looking at my job plans, is that reflective of the time? So, and I'll talk about this afternoon, but when you're looking at your workforce planning, you've got a view about actually what is happening. So that leads your planning decisions as well. I think that's where it becomes really valuable and powerful.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of that puzzle, isn't it? But
Yeah.
clinical hours to contact is much more focused on what actually happened. So
Yes.
what of the time that I actually had, what did I do with it? Which of course is part of the puzzle when you're thinking about what do I need.
So I'm thinking of that. So how do we bring this to life such
Yeah.
that it is useful? So you're looking at that, and I'm not sure how that's useful to me. So if I looked at this graph, we know it's made up.
Yeah,
But if it was my service, I'd be looking at it saying, well, why on day 7 did we only have 1.2
yeah,
clinical hours to contact?
Yeah.
That's what we could deliver. But yet on day 30, we're able to offer 1.8 clinical hours to contact. What's the difference? Why is it on that day we can deliver that and on that day? And there'll be a narrative behind that.
Yeah.
So and that comes back to your
Yeah.
concern is that, well, it will only, it won't tell us the stuff behind, and that's why we need both quantitative and qualitative data, don't we?
Yeah.
We need to own the data, and we need to be able to put the narrative. And it might be that that's all right that we did that, because it might be because
Yeah.
we've had a load of people off sick at that time. But it allows that lens through which we can start asking those questions. So that's one thing that's in my mind. And then the other thing I just wanted to share with you is, so regularly we get AHP linked to yourselves, competence say things like, and I'll give you an anecdote of one. I'm just reviewing my speech and language therapy services, acute, inpatient, and the speech therapists in our trust say that it's all right just to see 2 people per session on wards.
Yeah.
Is that right? What do other people do? What do other speech and language therapy services do? Now, this metric will allow us to compare like for like. Now, we won't ever get a totally like for like service, but you will be able to start to compare services that are similar. So you would expect speech and language therapy services onto wards in an acute hospital, which should be similar to speech and language therapy services delivered to acute wards in another hospital. And so we should start to be able to compare the clinical hours to contact across. But again, that's not the whole picture, is it? We then want to triangulate that with
Yeah.
outcome. So if these are only delivering this clinical hours to contact, but these are delivering this, what outcome do we get from that?
Yeah, and I think it's
Does
going
that
to
bring
be
it to life?
it's going to be that quality of data because
Yeah.
you know the practical sort of, and maybe this is too much down in
The weeds.
It is the fact that
Thank you.
know we have staff that are doing inpatients
Yeah.
and outpatients,
Yeah.
and actually teasing that apart
Yeah,
to the point where you actually know
yeah,
how you can use that data,
Yeah.
and I think that's really our
Yeah.
challenge. And within an acute trust that I work in,
yeah,
income comes from outpatients.
Yeah.
Yes.
yeah,
What's please? But actually, our biggest resource
Yes.
sits in inpatients,
Yeah.
which is all done either on block or pathway.
Yeah. yeah.
And I work within paediatrics and just don't even go there when you're talking about the community in an acute hospital, because even in our acute trust,
Yeah.
they don't actually know that
No.
we have a community service.
So I accept
so that's when we're
all of
dealing with
those
on a
things.
day-to-day
Yes,
basis.
I accept all of those things are challenging, and we could say to Lord, we could say, couldn't we, in response to these recommendations, we're not going to do it, it's too tricky. But actually what we need to be doing is unpicking gradually why it's tricky and making us more visible and more transparent. So these are just, each of these are baby steps on that journey. And we know that there will be all sorts of difficulties in trying to unpick. Sorry, can we just have one conversation? Because that's quite distracting when I'm trying. So we know that we'll be having all. I've lost my thought now. We know that there will be difficulty in trying to make it meaningful, but it's important that you start to collect it so that you can start to unravel those things that become difficult and eventually get to a place where it is meaningful. And just thinking about what we said about the weeds and how I bet all of you have got lots of information about number of referrals. You might be collecting direct time, indirect time, whether it was a phone call, whether it wasn't, whether all of that. You know, you've got all of that, but it doesn't move the conversation on anywhere. Whereas things like this, much more of a helicopter view, give you something quite objective to move the conversation on. And you might well want to go back to your data, all of that granular data that helps you understand why you had those dips and peaks, but at a level, instead of getting lost there, you're looking at something much more strategically, and that's what we're aiming to do here with this. But really important points, and really important that we all understand that it's just one piece of the puzzle, much like the job planning.
But I suppose the challenge that I see is quite often that the data's available to anyone to then view, so you'll get someone else in your organisation say, well, why can't you get to there?
Yeah, yeah,
And so it's great to have it,
yeah.
but then it opens up that question, and the narrative is then really key, isn't it, about outcomes, and then it gets more challenging. So you know, on one hand it's great to have it, on
Yeah.
the flip side it's not great to have it because it exposes where you might be
Yeah.
an outlier.
That goes for any data,
Well, of course
doesn't
it
it?
does,
So,
yeah.
and we, you know, I think we've. It feels like as AHPs we've been hiding behind that for quite some time. It's too difficult. We can't do it. We can't unpick it. We're not really sure. I see it as an advantage that we are starting to be asked to be visible and accountable,
Yeah.
and from that we will no doubt uncover things that perhaps we could be doing better, but equally we'll uncover a lot of things where we could make a difference and a positive difference. So I think it's just about absolutely, like you say, Chris, this is why I said at the beginning, it's your data, own it, start working with it, start understanding it, start preempting those questions. These are really valuable tools as leads that give you objective data and information to work with.
Can I just double check just so I make sure
Yeah.
I'm understanding?
Don't
it
ask me
correctly?
about the axes, Fiona.
I'm not going to ask you about that. I'm good. I'm good
Yeah.
with the SPC shop. We're good.
Fantastic.
The clinical hours that we're
Yes.
considering, so
Yes.
that is everything within the job plan
Yeah.
apart from the external duties.
Yes.
That's the bucket that's
Yes.
going in. That's
Yes.
the inputs.
Yes.
Okay.
So
that's fine.
whichever clinicians are in today and available to
Yeah.
deliver something,
Mhm.
that's the hours that you're counting. So if you had an e-roster system, that would give you that information quite easily. So,
It's just I suppose I'm anticipating that people are going, but I'm not all clinical. As
Yeah.
in, you know, I've just done my job plan.
Yes.
And these are my SPAs and these
Yes.
are my additional duties.
Yes.
So, you know, for a day a week,
Yeah.
I am the trust lead for whatever.
Yes.
I'm just sort of thinking how we play that and go, well, actually, no, this is showing how we use the resource that we've invested
exactly.
to serve our patients.
Yes,
sort of thing.
because it's really important that it's not all clinical, because you need to find that range of benchmarks that account for an acceptable level of the other stuff that needs to happen
Sure.
to deliver a gold
Sure.
standard service.
Yeah.
And if we only measured it on clinical time, we wouldn't be identifying where we're losing too much time, or perhaps not giving enough time to give good quality services in terms of CPD, service management, supervision, students, and all of that stuff that we want to do and we need to be able to do. So it's really important. That's why it's all in there.
Yeah, thank you. That's
So
very
sorry,
helpful.
all of this, those four then, that's all
Yes.
clinical time? Because I was thinking
Yes.
that was clinical time and that's
So,
non-clinical time.
so for the purposes of job planning,
Yeah,
the headings are quite clear, aren't they?
Yeah.
And the columns that map into DCC, which I know is consultant language, but the principles apply exactly to us, so we've stayed with those same headings.
Yeah.
So as you're planning your time, you need to be able to plan how much will be DCC, how much will be clinical service management, and how much will be other duties and all of the rest in your plan. When you're looking at so that's one lens of information. When you're looking at what actually happened, this is now looking at something different. This is looking at, of all my clinical people who were in today, how many patients did I see? And within those high, where we have trust where there's 4.5, you might see that you had all the people in today that are only 20% clinical on their job plan, because mostly they're doing something else with their time. They might be having more time in the clinical service management column.
Yeah.
So you might think, that's a bit strange. I wonder why I've got them all in on the same day, and then on the other days I haven't got those clinical. You know, it gives you information. It gives you any number of questions that you need to find answers to. Did that answer that question for you? We need a masterclass on clinical hours to contacts.
do,
This,
yeah.
to be fair, let's not. I'm sort of looking at the clock, and of course I will take some more questions. But you know, this is about introducing something to you. We realise that you will need much more help and guidance in order to get your heads around it, and that's probably not the time that we've got to do that today. This is introducing it to you as a concept, explaining why a deployment tracker is important, and giving you some examples of the kind of questions that it would help you ask yourselves if you were lucky enough to have this objective data. So but you did have one more question, did you?
So what it seems then is actually effectively